and said, "No," and that single word carried weight, because outside, unmarked vehicles had just sealed the block, because upstairs, the restaurant's private network had gone dark, because every phone at the billionaire table buzzed at once with alerts they didn't understand. And Randall Cross tried to laugh it off until he saw his bank app refresh and freeze, until he saw balances locked pending investigation, and Marcus Bell's smile vanished when his assistant texted in all caps that the oil shipment had been seized, and Simon Drake sobered instantly when his lawyer called and said only, "Don't say anything." And Victor Hale felt something he hadn't felt since he was a nobody, uncertainty. And he demanded to know who the teen was, demanded it loudly, angrily, and the teen finally answered, his voice calm, almost gentle as he said, "My name is Elijah Moore." And that name meant nothing to them, and that was the point, because Elijah Moore wasn't famous, he wasn't flashy, he didn't trend, because Elijah Moore operated where cameras didn't go. And the second twist unfolded as the restaurant's owner emerged, pale and shaking, and addressed Elijah by a different title. A title that made Victor's knees weaken. A title associated with a private global trust that quietly dismantled monopolies, exposed corruption, and redistributed billions through channels that left no fingerprints, a trust rumored to be backed by old money and newer ghosts. And Elijah Moore wasn't just a beneficiary, he was the executor. Groomed since childhood after a tragedy no one reported. Educated by people whose names were redacted. Tested in environments that broke grown men. And chosen not because he wanted power but because he understood restraint. And Victor Hale laughed then, desperate, saying it was impossible, that a black teenager couldn't possibly hold that kind of authority. And Elijah met his gaze and said, "That's why it works." And the room seemed to tilt as agents entered. Not police, something quieter, something final, and they handed Victor documents outlining years of fraud, labor exploitation, and political bribery. Evidence gathered patiently, legally, impeccably, and Victor tried to bargain, to threaten, to buy his way out, but Elijah shook his head again and said, "This was never about me." And that was the third twist, because Elijah explained that this wasn't revenge, it was calibration, that the world had been skewed by men who confused dominance with worth, and his role was simply to correct the angle. And one by one the four men were escorted out, not in handcuffs but in silence, their empires already collapsing behind them like sandcastles under tide. And when the restaurant returned to its soft music and murmurs, Elijah sat back down, finished his water, paid for his meal with cash, and left a tip large enough to change a life, because power, real power, didn't announce itself, and outside the rain had stopped, and the city breathed. Again, and the final twist came weeks later when news broke of a new scholarship fund, quietly launched, funding education in neighborhoods the four men had once displaced. A fund administered by a trust with no public face, and somewhere, walking through another door, blending into another crowd, Elijah Moore adjusted his hoodie and kept moving, because the world would never stop underestimating him, and that was exactly how he intended to save it. Night is over, for men will learn that money can't buy mercy, that prejudice can blind even the powerful, and that the quiet black teenager they mocked is the last person on earth they should have touched. So if you believe real power hides in plain sight and you want more stories that expose truth, justice, and shocking twists, hit subscribe right now and stay with me until the end. Because this story turns everything you think you know upside down. The maitre d' had just finished polishing the crystal glasses when the doors of Levant Prime swung open and the sound of rain followed a small figure inside. A black teenager in a simple hoodie, sneakers scuffed from walking, shoulders slightly hunched as if the world had trained him to make himself smaller. And no one noticed him at first because the restaurant was glowing with wealth, all mahogany and gold light, filled with executives and politicians and the kind of men who spoke loudly, because they were used to being obeyed, including four men seated at the center table: Victor Hale, the billionaire tech investor whose name was etched into buildings across the country, his hedge fund partner Randall Cross, oil heir Marcus Bell, and real estate mogul Simon Drake. Men who had spent their lives believing consequences were for other people. Men who laughed too hard and drank too much and mistook cruelty for confidence. And when the teen quietly asked the host for a table, Randall smirked and muttered something about wrong neighborhood. Marcus snorted and Simon waved his hand as if shooing a fly, and the laughter that followed was sharp enough to cut. And the teen felt it land on him like stones but said nothing, because he had learned long ago that silence was armor, that sometimes surviving meant letting insults pass through you like rain. So he was led to a small table near the back, ordered water and the cheapest item on the menu, and sat still, eyes scanning the room with an awareness that didn't match his age, because what no one in that room knew was that this night had been set in motion years ago, when his mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent, when his father disappeared into a system that never returned him whole, when a private driver once told him, without knowing who he was speaking to, that some people were born to rule and others to serve, and the teen remembered thinking then that the world loved masks, that it never looked twice at what didn't glitter, and as Victor Hale raised his glass and toasted to another acquisition, the teen's phone vibrated once in his pocket, a single coded message that read simply, "Confirmed?" And he exhaled slowly, because patience had always been his greatest weapon, and the first twist came when Simon Drake, already drunk and itching for amusement, stood up and deliberately bumped into the teen's table, spilling water across the floor and sneering, "Watch where you're sitting, kid." And the room went quiet, that uncomfortable quiet where everyone pretends not to see, and the teen stood as well, calm, eyes level, voice steady as he said, "It's fine." But Simon laughed and shoved him back into the chair, and that was when Victor Hale finally looked over, annoyed not by the cruelty but by the disruption, and said, "Handle it, Simon, I don't want a scene." And Simon handled it by grabbing the teen's hoodie and hissing something ugly and unnecessary. And in that moment the teen's mind flashed through memories of restraint training, of boardrooms and briefing rooms no one would ever imagine he had entered, of men twice Simon's size who had learned too late that underestimation was fatal. But he didn't move yet, because the real shock wasn't meant to be physical. It was meant to be undeniable, and as security rushed over, the teen calmly reached into his pocket and placed a black metal card on the table, not flashy, no logo, just a thin line of silver along the edge, and the head of security froze mid-step, color draining from his face, because he recognized it instantly, because that card didn't belong to kids in hoodies. It belonged to people who didn't wait in lines, people whose calls rerouted governments, and Victor Hale noticed the change and frowned, irritation turning to curiosity, and he stood, towering, voice smooth as he said, "What's going on here?" And the teen looked up at him and for the first time allowed a hint of something else into his expression. Not anger, not fear, but certainty, and said, "Your men touched me." And Victor scoffed, because the idea was absurd, because power had insulated him from accountability for so long that the concept felt foreign. And he said, "You want an apology? Fine. Take it and leave." And the teen shook his head slightly and said, "No," and that single word carried